Why is it important? Why do we care about Rome? Here are the main things. That's our picture of the forum behind it. So let's just start out with the most important things about Rome from the point of view of making the Western mind. Number one, most important thing that Rome does is extend Greece. Most important thing. Now, it didn't have to. It didn't have to be interested in Greece. It didn't have to care particularly about Greece. It could have hated Greece. It could have hated other neighbors, but it didn't. It didn't. Rome and Romans loved Greece, grew to love it more every century as it got to know it better, incorporated its ideas into its educational system, incorporated its language into the educational system, and essentially by the time of Julius Caesar and Cicero, Rome is a bilingual culture, Greek and Latin, for the upper class, for the educated class. And I don't think there's ever another culture in the ancient world so bilingual as this one in 50 BC. There's no other example of this. So Rome likes Greece, and Rome extends Greece, and there's evidence all over Rome for the love that the Romans have for Greece. So, for example, take the Pantheon. The Pantheon is the most spectacular building in ancient Rome. It's maybe the most spectacular building to survive for 2,000 years, ever. And it is a miracle of Roman engineering. The Romans figured out how to build a building with a single room, with a single roof, spanning the widest amount of space ever constructed, and figured out how to do it because they knew how to use cement. They knew how to use cement. They knew how to build buildings with cement like nobody else had ever done before. And so they create this incredible dome that is essentially a great big piece of cement. It's stone, and I know none of you are going to want to go back in there ever again because you're going to look up and think, oh my God, all that stone if that falls down, which would be a very bad thing. But it hasn't for 2,000 years, so that's pretty good so far. So the Romans invented the engineering to allow them to do that, but they loved Greece so much that they took their beautiful Pantheon, which is a huge round building with a huge round roof on it, and they stuck on a little tiny Greek porch, a cute little Greek temple porch. It has little Greek columns and a pretty little Greek pediment, looks just like the Parthenon, and it's just a tiny little porch compared to the incredibly great building they built. But they didn't know how great their building was. They didn't realize that they, the Romans, were building a great building. They just knew if it was going to be great, it should have a little Greek porch on it, right? So they popped it on there, and when you go to the Parthenon, you'll go through this little narrow Greek porch, and you'll go into this huge, incredibly great Roman building. That is the best way to remember how the Romans felt about Greece. They loved Greece. They loved Greece. They wanted to be like the Greeks. They all went to Athens to learn Greek. Every single member of the upper class in the first century went to Athens to learn Greek so they could come home and tell all their friends, I just got back from Athens. That's the fancy, snooty thing to do from the point of view of us, is go to France, go to Paris, learn French, become good in French, and you're set. Well, that was just the way it was in Rome in 50 BC. Go to Athens, spend some time, preferably when you're young and can fool around and have a lot of fun, and drink a lot of Greek wine, and learn Greek, and come home and wow everybody that you know Greek. So there you are with the first item on the screen. Rome extends Greece. Now, of course, in the extension, it's not just that it liked Greece, but it's that it picked up and carried the whole of the Greek cultural heritage to Italy and everywhere else that the Romans went. It picked up the whole Greek culture, all the things we talked about. So all the names we've mentioned, Plato, Aristotle, everybody else, they all know all these writers, these Greek writers, and love them and have their copies and teach them to their children in their schools or their tutorials. So Rome is extending the classical tradition, the ideas, the books, the values, and the gods and the religion and the stories and the Homeric stories, all of that is all being extended into Italy and into Rome. And when Rome hands this great cultural heritage along to the successor states, the successor cultures, for example, let's take Charlemagne in the year 800, he will get from Rome an entire collection of Latin books that he and his cultural ministers can understand, and he will get all of that which has been put into Latin from Greece and carry that to Paris and Aachen and Spain and London. So the greatness of Athens that's being handed along to the greatness of Rome will then be handed along through the Middle Ages, because remember, the Middle Ages never lose Latin. They never lose Latin. They have Latin without any break from the time of, 753. That's one of the earliest Latin inscriptions. All the way through to the fall of Rome, say 400, 500, and then all those cultures that come either into Italy or carry Italian ideas outside of Italy, like the Carolingians to France, they will get everything that Rome knew in the time of Caesar and Cicero. And of course, that period of Charlemagne, 800, is absolutely vital to all of us, because that is the moment at which all the books of the Roman world, all the Latin works of the Roman world, will be copied. Multiple copies, thousands of manuscript copies will be made around 800, thanks to Charlemagne, and those books will then be handed along to 900, 1000, 1100, 1200, Paris, London, Sevilla, Naples. So, the fact that Rome embraced Greece and loved Greece and learned Greek and studied the books of the Greeks. You can read Augustine. There he is reading those Greeks there in North Africa and making all kinds of comments about them. He found Homer very difficult, but he was trying. He was trying to learn Greek so he could read Homer in Greek, but he thought it was hard. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, Rome extends Christianity. Now, you see, think about that. Think about what Rome is going to do here. Think about the incredible thing that's going to go on in Rome. On the one hand, it's going to extend the entire Greek cultural heritage through Rome and to all the other people who will be able to carry it on in Latin. And it extends the entire Judeo-Christian story through Rome to the whole rest of the world. So think about that. Think about the double action, the double heritage that Rome will be responsible for. Nobody ever imagined that Rome was going to have anything to do with Christianity. Nobody knew that. It was just a little crazy cult in Israel, in Jerusalem. Crazy, these crazy Christians. Nuts, crazy, nutty people. And then Peter and Paul and others came to Rome, and pretty soon there was a little Roman community, 100 people, 200 people, 300 people. Pretty soon there were more, and slowly the center of Christianity moved out of Jerusalem and over to Rome, and then, of course, you know the rest of the story. So there you have then a double road leads to Rome. How about that? Isn't that fascinating? A double road. Two great roads lead to Rome. And in Rome, the four great cultural pillars of Western civilization will be united. The four great ones. Greece, Rome, Jews, Christians. Those four will all be brought together in Rome, in Roman houses, in Roman villas, in Roman families, where they'll be studying Greek in Athens. They'll be reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. All of these roads are all leading to Rome. How about that? Number three, Rome gives us, gives the world an idea. Now, the idea of Rome never dies. Even when Rome itself stops being the political center of the Mediterranean, the idea of Rome never dies. And so in the 800s and the 900s, so many people, like Charlemagne, want to be a Christian emperor. They want to be crowned in Rome. They want to be a Roman emperor. They want to continue the empire. Charlemagne and his team didn't for 1 minute think that Rome had fallen in 476. Nobody in Charlemagne's court thought Rome had fallen. They thought Rome had continued to them. They were a continuation of Rome. And so will other emperors. There will be German emperors, and there will be Luxembourg emperor, Henry VII. There'll be all different kinds of people who want to be called Roman emperor. Why? The idea of Rome. What was the idea of Rome? Universal state, universal peace, universal accord, the ecumene, that word we met with Alexander, the ecumene, the one world. That was the dream. And when Charlemagne wants to be a Holy Roman Emperor, that's because he imagines that maybe the Carolingians will be able to create an empire like the one that he admires in Rome. So there's an idea that never dies. And so, for example, I'll give you a wonderful good example. King Alfred in Britain in the 700s, who's running a nice little British state there. You know, he's doing just fine up there in Britain. He goes to Rome. Now imagine how long it takes you to travel from York to Rome in 750. I mean, can you imagine? There's no channel. I mean, it would take you forever. It took him, 2 months to do the trip. He did it twice in his lifetime. Why? Because he had to see Rome. He thought he was building on Rome. He thought his British state was building on Rome. He loved Rome. He loved the idea that he was connected to Rome. So a lot of people do. And so the idea never dies. It's always there. Number 4, a model of government. Now, we're all so used to this, we don't even think about it. But we have to think about it because you have to realize, you have to just hit yourself over the head and say, remember, John Adams and James Madison and George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin were all sitting there reading their Cicero and their Livy. They were all reading about the Roman Republic. And they were saying to each other, if we get our revolution, we should have a Roman Republic. We should have a republic like Rome had. And then they read their books. And then they went and read more books. And then they said, well, what did they do about, they had a Senate. Well, that's a great idea. Let's have a Senate. And on and on and on and on through the list of things that they learned about Rome. 2 elected branches, 2 branches of popular representation, 1 the Senate, 1 the Assembly, the House of Representatives. Exactly what they built. Exactly. They were taking it right out of Rome. They were just sitting there reading their books and saying, they all had their copies of Cicero in Latin. They carried them around. Benjamin Franklin carried his Cicero in Latin to Paris and talked with all the fancy French intellectuals, parlez, right? Parlez-vous, right? And they talked about Cicero. They talked about Cicero because the French were reading it in Latin and the Americans were reading it in Latin, and so they knew exactly what they were talking about. Model for government. A distinct, specific model that people use. Now, it isn't just the Americans. All through history, that's 1776, but all through history from Cicero's time, for 1,800 years, people use it. The French revolutionaries, they do the same thing. All kinds of revolutionaries in the 19th century, they do the same thing. So many, 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 many periods in history, people go back to the Roman government that was set up as a republic around the year 500 BC. So it's perfectly fair for you people to round everything off and figure out that our discussion here of Rome is roughly 500 BC to 500 AD. It's very easy to remember that. 500 BC to 500 AD. Right? 1,000 years, nice and easy. 500 before the zero, 500 year after the zero, right? Right? So it's 1,000 years. And that's the story. The Republic is 500 BC. And so from the birth of the Republic, roughly 500, Rome becomes a model for many, many, many states.